Iniciamos.
We now start panel 2 and would like to welcome Mr. Polo Lopes, Executive President of Brazil Steel Institute, who will be the moderator of this panel. We would also like to welcome Sergio Leite de Andrade, member of the board of Brazil Steel Institute, CEO of Usiminas. Gustavo Werneck, member of the board of Brazil Steel Institute, CEO of Gerdau. Frederico Ayres Lima, member of the board of Brazil Steel Institute and CEO of Esperança America. Marcelo Chara, member of the board of Brazil Steel Institute, president of Ternium, Brazil. We will now announce the rules for this panel. The moderator will have 10 minutes for his initial considerations, and afterwards we will have a debate that will last 60 minutes. At the end, each speaker will have 5 minutes for their final considerations. So now the floor is of the moderator, Mr. Polo of Mello Lopes. Good morning to all. Let us start our panel. But I would like to thank Minister Tarcísio for participating during the opening of our Congress, and on behalf of the steel industry of Brazil, congratulate the minister for his outstanding performance leading the Ministry of Infrastructure. I will start by showing some slides, showing some information about the sector to help us understand the issues that will be debated in sequence by our CEOs. So let's start here with our presentation. And I start by touching on the profile of this sector. Let's move on then to the first slide. So we have a producing complex with 31 steel mills, 15 integrated and 16 mini mills, an installed capacity of 51 million tons per year of raw steel. So it's important to keep these numbers in mind because this will serve for some comparisons and references that we will make further down the road. Investments from 2008 to 2020 of $28.2 billion. The forecast for 21 to 25 is an additional $8 billion. So in the pipeline, we have an additional $8 billion and raw steel production of 31.4 million tons. The next slide shows a global view. We are the 9th largest producer in the world. It's interesting to see the production of Germany and Turkey, which are 7th and 8th. The next slide is interesting because it gives us a snapshot of steel consumption in Brazil. 3 segments correspond to over 82%. Civil construction, capital goods, and automotive, which represent 82.1%. It's important to keep these numbers in mind to understand what was our roller coaster in 2020. The next slide shows a concept that we believe is very important, referring to steel consumption, GDP, always strongly related. Steel consumption, economic development, and GDP are unassociable. On the left of the slide, we can see the GDP growth and apparent consumption. They are almost superimposed. To the right, we see a correlation between GDP and apparent consumption of steel products with a very strong correlation as well. Speaking in terms of consumption, it's important to look at this slide, which shows the per capita consumption of steel products. If we look at 1980, we will see that China that year consumed 32 kilograms per inhabitant, and Brazil 100 kilograms per inhabitant. In 2020, China is at 691 kilograms per inhabitant, and Brazil continues at 100 kilograms. So for 40 years, we were moving along sideways, while other nations like Chile and Mexico have grown significantly. Speaking about the overall scenario, this slide shows that from 2013 to 2019, we have a strong drop in internal sales of steel products of around 23%. It's important to also recollect these numbers. Now and then, we see conceptual discussions with regard to the sector capacity of supplying the internal demand. Certainly, we will touch on this during our debate with my colleagues here. Our problem is not of supply, but of demand. In the next slide, this was already mentioned by Frederico. We had an expectation that 2020 would be the year of the recovery. We started the year operating at 63% of installed capacity. Then the pandemic came. Then social distancing came. But together with social distancing, we had a very strong demand crisis, which was not analyzed deeply. So we can see here, based on the graph, that during April, at the peak of this crisis, the three sectors that we identified in the consumption pie chart, the automobile industry closed 5 plants, several dealerships, and several companies closed, and civil construction also suffered tremendously. At that time, we were working at 45% installed capacity, as already mentioned by Frederico. We closed 4 blast furnaces and several steel mills. We put equipment back online when the recovery came, and we had a tremendous reaction of the sector in June by placing more in the internal market than we were putting in the internal market in the month preceding the pandemic. The next slide seems like an electrocardiogram, but shows the aspect of an important phenomenon that occurred not just in Brazil, but around the world, which was the boom of commodities. We can see that our main raw materials and inputs grew in price significantly. That is the case of ore, coal, scrap, and this chart will serve as a basis for our discussion. This shows an inflection of some of these raw materials. But ore, which is strategic, was bought at the start of last year at $75. It reached $230, and today it's around $120. Here we also share the progression of prices in the domestic markets of other countries, showing that significant increases occurred to Brazilian steel products based on what we saw in the preceding slide. But in comparison to other countries, for example, hot rolled coils and rebar, we are in third position here. This was not a Brazilian phenomenon, it was global. And the prices overall did not just occur in Brazil, they occurred worldwide. The next slide shows a snapshot that we understand as being very important for us to understand the dynamics of what happens in the steel world. Here we see the evidence of access to 562 million tons around the world, and the greatest volume concentrated in China, 121 million tons. Of course, this brings harmful effects, as we can see in this slide, where all countries wound up protecting themselves. President Trump in 2018 put Section 232, closed U.S. to Chinese imports. 15 days later, the European Union also protected itself. And the open area is the area of Latin America or South America, where we have the largest market being Brazil. Reaching our end, I share data that I consider important for our discussion with regard to imports. Much was said during these months about the narratives of increasing imports, make imports feasible to offer greater supply in the market. We saw imports of 2.7 million tons without any exceptional measures being adopted to make available or possible this level of imports. We're 2 slides from the end. And I would like to share our forecasts. It's very good to identify that in November 2020, the Brazilian steel industry forecast its growth for 2021 of 5.8 when compared to 2020. In May of this year, we reviewed this. We increased this growth from 5.8 to 15%. And in July of 21, we again changed the forecast to a growth of 24%. So the sector estimates a growth of 26.8 million tons. 2 concepts that I would like to share with all of you regarding steel, which is the fact that it is absolutely necessary to the life of peoples. Invisible steel, steel that is in the life of all of us. Finally, a concept regarding the strategic participation of steel regarding national sovereignty. With this, I conclude my presentation, and let us, without further ado, start our questions. I would just like to recall how we will conduct this. The idea of our panel is for all participants to comment on the same question. So let's try to be very dynamic in our discussions. So each participant will have a 3-minute limit so that we can address more questions. As already announced by our Master of Ceremonies, each participant will have 5 minutes for their final considerations. I will start by setting a thought-provoking question. After a roller coaster in 2020 with a demand crisis, supply crisis, stress among consumers, and we had a lot of stress here, requests to reduce import taxation of steel-related products. The question is, how is the market in 2021? Is it normal? Inventory levels at distributors, the pressure of prices versus commodities. Sergio, let's start with you. Good morning to all. Excellent point. For us to reflect on the last years of the steel industry in Brazil, the second decade of 2021 was lost. This decade involved facing great difficulty, the greatest recession of Brazilian history, where the country, along 11 half years, was under recession, and we have a very positive perspective of growth. The first quarter of 2020 was indicating to be very strong for the Brazilian economy and, of course, for the steel industry. With the advent of the pandemic, which started on February 25th here in Brazil with the first official case, we started a situation of an impact to the economic life of the country. This impact proved very strongly to occur in April. Within this scenario of a pandemic in Brazil, companies started adopting a series of measures, among which reducing their inventories to preserve their cash flow. In the second quarter, we had a strong acceleration. In the second half of the year, we started supplying the Brazilian market at levels higher to the preceding quarters prior to the pandemic. The steel industry reacted very strongly. In the market, we needed to receive steel very quickly, and we also needed to replenish our inventory very quickly. As Marcos already commented so well, we faced many issues. The steel industry has a track record of facing problems. In the second half of 2020 and the first quarter of 21, worked very strongly to produce. We produced at high levels. We normalized the market supply. And to conclude your question, we can say that supply is normalized. Inventory levels are at a normal level. The steel industry is supplying both in quantity and quality the needs of consumers, and we from the steel industry are ready for new challenges that certainly will be forthcoming. Thank you very much, Sergio. Frederico, could you answer? Okay. Good morning to all. Sergio made a good summary. And when we take your presentation, I would just like to highlight one point. We talk about import taxes, etc. Our sector suffered 20-30% drops during the recession. Exiting from this recession, we expected growth. And now that we are perceiving the regrowth, the last quarter of last year was a strong recovery. And now that we are in a scenario of going back to exporting, and most groups here represented have already announced investments, so they're very sure of what is forthcoming. So I think it would be very wrong to talk about drops in rates. I agree with Sergio. The market is already replenished, and some chains already have high inventory levels. Marco Polo presented this very well. Now what we need is to grow. I like a lot that chart that Marco Polo shared, where you have the apparent consumption per capita per country. Brazil was stagnated since 1980 until the beginning of this decade. So what we need is the country to develop so that we can exit this level that we are currently at. The local industry capacity is strongly based on local consumption. Soon we will be exporting good volumes, as has been the history of this industry. And what we need is to focus on the country development and not narratives that are difficult to justify when we see the numbers.
Well done. Gustavo now. I would like to start by greeting everyone who's participating in this meeting. Marco, in your last slide with indispensable steel and listening to the colleagues, I remembered something that focuses on another aspect. I have two children, a girl, Mariana, 12, and Lucas, 10 years old. And I send greetings to the Northeast and to Minas Gerais. My children were born in these different regions. Now, Lucas, my son, is now in remote schooling. But then they started to re-socialize again. And so my son and his colleagues were together at home, and I said to them, let's do a game. I will say a word, and you write the first thing that comes to your mind. So I gave one piece of paper to each one, and I said, steel. And they started to draw. And then later on, I collected the drawings, and I took my son's, and he had designed a generator, an air generator. And I said, why did you do that? He said, because I'm studying this in school. And I remember that I took him to Petrolina once to show him an aero generator that we have there. And a colleague of my son designed a very nice car. And I said, why did you draw a car? And she said, because it's my father's dream. He dreams of buying an electrical car. And another girl designed a house. She said they have a house by the beach, and they decided to use a metal structure. Another boy designed Superman. And then I collected these papers to take away, and I said, okay, the game is over. And they thought it was a bit boring. Anyway, I started to think in the office about those drawings, to think about steel and what steel represents in the lives of people. Because if we had this game some 20 years ago, all of them would have designed little industries with the smoke coming out of the chimney. So it's very important to reflect on what steel means to Brazilian society. The market is being satisfied, and I was impressed with the speed for us to go back to production and to satisfy our consumers. There are other sectors that find difficulty in supplying their customers. Besides replenishing the market, we managed to do that very quickly. And this goes to show that the sector is prepared with high capacity, high speed, and to cater to future demands as well. Marcelo, I have another provocation here for you. Besides listening to all the comments, whether or not the market is normalized. Since you focus the international market, and I mentioned here the drop in the cost of commodities. Well, coal did not. Coal went up $400 now. Since you have this international view, I would like you to comment on this for us, and also the opinion of others. Thank you. I will try and speak Portuñol.
Acompañando los comentarios de mis colegas.
Well, clearly, along with the comments of my colleagues, a new era has started all over the world. We are very much connected to Italy, and we have a hospital in our group, which is a reference in the north of Italy. And we saw the size of the pandemic and the number of deaths, and it was really scary. And this spread all over the world, and demand disappeared altogether. We have a plant in Santa Cruz. We have an integrated plant and the blast furnace for 5 million tons. We were producing at a full speed. And then in 5 weeks, we had to reduce 60%. And the blast furnace, you have to operate that close to 100%, and 60% was never done before in our plant. It was a very deep adaptation that was required, besides having to take care of safety and the protocols, the health protocols. Our operations include oxygen plants, and we supplied to hospitals. And we had to renegotiate all of our supply contracts, and we had to go into maximum production all of the sudden. 75 to 80% of our production is exported, North America, US, Mexico, and a little to Europe. But we had to export to places we never exported before. We exported to Asia, and this goes to show the capacity the Brazilian industry has to reinvent itself. And so we went from producing 3 million tons to 4.8 million tons. This created huge stress on the demand of all raw materials in the sector. Charcoal, for instance. Charcoal is at a peak of 400. The rest of raw materials sort of accommodated. The rest of the Brazilian industry turned to the domestic market and reduced exports, and we are slowly going back to exporting again. And the prices of commodities have increased due to this world trend. Charcoal has specificity. China, Australia, and India are the main producers of charcoal. China went looking for other suppliers. Mongolia, for instance, they produce 30 million tons per year. 90% of China's production is consumed locally. And Australia started to place its exports. And then there were specific factors in China, heavy floods.
La producción de energía eléctrica.
Also, they had to deviate some of coal production to power production because they had a shortage of power.
Total.
China went around looking for coal to buy, and this is why the price went up so much.
Bien iniciado el 2022.
Perfeito, Marcelo.
We believe they will be the same in the beginning of 2022. Well, let us move on to the second question. I would like Gustavo to start, just for us to see who starts in our chat. Our imports of milled products represented 2.6 million tons, which is about 17% of our domestic sales. Now, is this level of export something that is here to stay? What do you think? Well, my feeling about this is that export levels in the last few years in Brazil, well, the market is open. If anyone wishes to import, they can. So I think this is historic level, but I have the feeling this import level is going to be reduced in time because the service quality we provide our steel customers has increased a lot. Take a city like São Paulo with all the traffic problems it has and so on. It is fantastic. We produce a screen kit. We produce one, we put on a truck, and the delivery takes place. The level of service we provide our customers will hardly be provided by imported products.
Então eu vejo, né, quando a gente olha mais
I see that the quality of our service is something without parallel if you talk about imports.
por esse aspecto que no meu ponto de vista é significativo.
In my opinion, this is a very significant factor. Now, if we consider the last 10 years, they're talking about 11.5, and now they're around 14%. So this is a historic level. Well, concerning imports, the first aspect we have to consider is that importing is a commercial option. It happens in the Brazilian steel market. Importing is free in the last 10 years, as you said. It stayed around 11%, and this year it's a little higher due to a context of growth in the steel price in the international market. Along the last months of last year and in the first 7 months of this year, and in my opinion, imports will remain in the level we saw in the last 10 years. The main drama in importing is that mostly imports come from countries where there is an asymmetry in trade relations with Brazil. If we take the origin of the largest country that exports to Brazil, China, China is also the country that is the main culprit of anti-dumping suits in the world. No doubt, they are the leader in anti-dumping processes and suits. And the world is noticing that already. In Brazil, we have to consider this more seriously. We have to look at anti-dumping suits as the procedure to bring symmetry back to the international market. We have also seen situations where China is still not a market economy, and this no doubt brings greater intensity to the asymmetry. And as you showed us, Marco, when we look at the international situation, we notice that there have been movements to defend and to protect markets all over the world, but not in South America. And it doesn't make sense. In Brazil, we're in favor of economic liberalism. We want a world with isonomy in trade relations, but we cannot defend or practice in Brazil liberalism, whereas the rest of the world is protectionist. And in the last few years, we noticed that South America did not promote the defense of its markets. And Brazil is outstanding here. What we want is fair trade practices where isonomy is the strong point. Thank you, Sergio. There are questions coming into my WhatsApp, and I think they will help to feed our panel. Marcel, along the same line of imports, and then Frederico will close. Well, I fully agree to the comments. And to add to what Sergio said, we have to have isonomy and clear rules, because to import steel from subsidized sources is losing the incentive, the competitiveness of investment made in Brazil to produce goods and wealth here in the country, as well as jobs. So there is no miracle. Cheap steel comes from subsidized sources.
Stava ben acima del 20%.
The industrial jobs are the most developed in industrial societies. Industrial societies are fully developed in education, in generation of wealth, in attraction of investment. We mustn't, the Brazilian steel industry does not need protection. It needs isonomy because this is fair. Frederico, well, I will close the discussion. Everyone has spoken already. I think when Gustavo mentioned the service we provide to clients, I think it is a fact. I think all the groups present here have the capacity to cater just in time to the automotive industry. I think services are a very good point. I liked what Sergio and Marcelo said because to import steel means to export jobs and wealth, right? Because it generates lots of jobs and wealth. So a country with surplus capacity, which hasn't yet attained its ideal capacity, and which generates less CO2 than the steel you import. So in these conditions, a country that produces everything that is consumed, we just don't produce what is not consumed. So a country like this, importing 17% of its consumption, is senseless.
Indo para o terceiro.
Very well. Moving on to our third topic, I would like to mention that steel, as we saw before, is present everywhere. Its main characteristic is that it is indispensable. The sector has invested 28 billion in the last few years. There are another 8 billion in the pipeline. We are the second largest economy in the world, but our per capita consumption remains unaltered in 100 kilos per inhabitant. The question then is, what should be done to guarantee sustainable development of the domestic market? I will start by giving the floor to Frederico. Thank you. Well, I think your presentation has dealt with that very well. You showed two correlations, GDP and the growth in steel, and then a long time what the behavior of countries was. In practice, they both go together. The country cannot develop without consuming steel, and there is no production of steel without development. Now, this leads to a difficult question. How can we have both develop together? I think the main homework we have to do as a country is what was called asymmetry before, and I would call that the Brazil cost. Our country needs to improve its competitiveness in general. Our plant is 300 kilometers from the port with a railroad connecting to the port. It is cheaper to have steel at the port coming from Asia than coming from our plant.
Porque realmente a gente vê os esforços que estão sendo feitos.
We see the efforts that are being developed. Minister Tarcísio gave good examples, but it is obvious we still need a lot to do. We have a huge homework.
Consumo aparente de aço para o patamar que todos nós aqui sonhamos, muito superior aos 100 quilos por habitante.
And we all dream of a level of consumption higher than 100 kilos per inhabitant.
Marcelo, go ahead. The infrastructure sector has a huge potential. Here, when we heard Minister Tarcísio talking, this is a topic that is significant. The gas industry is undergoing transition to decarbonize, but it also leverages the entire industry. This would potentialize several industries and projects. Other countries, they have a gas cost that is 3-4 times lower than us. We need to work on proactive and creative projects. We can work on energy integration. We are working together with authorities in Brazil to see if we can get a partnership regarding gas with Argentina. They could export and integrate this in Brazil. So we need to develop pipelines and the infrastructure to increase competitiveness, and projects associated to logistics and to reduce the Brazilian cost have a huge potential, and we need to fathom this more. Just 2 points. I agree. I would like to add 2 things. The importance of these infrastructure investments to generate jobs and wealth for Brazil. We have to be very careful on this point. The second point I would like to recall is that infrastructure has 2 impacts. It generates consumption and gives competitiveness for the industry to have demand. This is homework. Marcelo talked about several points regarding gas. All of this leads to steel. Marcos commented, Werneck as well. Steel is all over. It will generate consumption and competitiveness for the industry. Sergio, go ahead, and Gustavo concluded. I have 3 more questions regarding this subject as well. This is a situation that we live in Brazil that is atypical when compared to the world. Among the 30 largest economies in Brazil, Brazil is the only one that continues with the same steel consumption for the last 40 years, and it is stabilized at a low level. If it were at a higher level, we would be at a very comfortable level. This is a challenge that we have faced for 40 years in Brazil. We undertook a series of actions, but the result that we obtained did not correspond to the efforts that we made. As already commented here, the solution is to invest in infrastructure, in civil construction. In Brazil, we have a deficit of housing of more than 8 million units. A movement of dealing with this would certainly increase steel consumption in an important fashion. In this housing, in Belo Horizonte, we have the so-called Casa Cor. This is an annual event that occurs in several cities across Brazil. Usiminas is participating in Belo Horizonte. And there we shared a steel house that is aesthetically very beautiful. This was designed by architects. It is functional, totally in steel. And this is our positioning to offer alternatives to the market. This has to do with what Frederico already mentioned. The true solution is for the country to grow and strongly invest in infrastructure, civil construction, the oil and gas sector that is promising in terms of steel consumption can offer a significant contribution once it invites the Brazilian industry to participate. So we have a great challenge for the next 10 years. We can't arrive at 2030 with the same 100 kilograms per inhabitant. Perfect, Sergio Gustavo. I would like to add 2 quick points. And also would like to hear our participants. The first point is the need of reducing the size of the state. I continue believing that we can continue to privatize. When we talk about sanitation, the advances we saw in recent months have already translated into new orders and improvement of social conditions here in Brazil. So this agenda can be carried out. The second point is very practical. It's called metallic construction. For people who are participating with us, you need to understand that this is a reality. When we look at first world cities, when we look at South Korea, for example, one of the leverages of this growth of steel consumption was metallic construction, modern construction, speedy construction with less environmental impact. So this is a short-term topic that needs to grow in Brazil. So I would like to invite the consumers who participate here with us today to increase this debate on metallic construction in Brazil. Excellent.
roteiro já para poder atender as perguntas.
I would like to accommodate some of the questions that we are receiving that are very nice, and we have a large number of questions. We're talking about the market, so I'm going to join two questions to see who would like to answer these. And later we come back to the topics that we were discussing previously. So the first point is, what about steel demand in the agribusiness? How is the alignment of these sectors in Brazil in the view of our panelists? The growth of agribusiness, is this also leveraging the steel sector? How? So I would like to also add to this, with the advancement of electric motors, what is the expectation of the steel mills to drop the volume of this sector? So first, the agribusiness. It's doing very well, high level of development. And second, the technological development of EVs. And probably we'll see a lower consumption level. So who would like to answer this? I can start. The agribusiness sector is very important to us at Gerdau. We service this sector in several forms. It has grown, the demand is very high, and not just in the domestic market. Our clients that act in this area, they increase exports significantly. If we take the sector of agricultural machinery, this has required a lot of steel to meet the domestic market as well as for exports. So I think we will continue acting in this. Regarding EVs, there is a transition phase that will probably take some time, which are the hybrid cars. We don't think EVs will take over the market so quickly. In hybrid cars, we have seen an increase in steel consumption in these vehicles. So we don't foresee a decrease in demand for EVs and hybrid vehicles in the near future. Much to the contrary. Agriculture. Would anybody like to comment?
Eu queria comentar.
I would like to comment the following regarding EVs.
Oh,
So
el carro eléctrico es
electric vehicles for us is a challenge.
usinas.
We have 17 plants throughout all Americas, Colombia, U.S., Argentina, etc. We manufacture plates in Brazil and rolled steel for EVs. This requires
Importante y requiere de una
steel that has been technologically leveraged. It needs to have high resistance, that is deformable, requires welding technologies.
que tem para nós uma oportunidade.
I think this is an extraordinary opportunity to integrate this to EVs.
Minha parte seria do aço elétrico também.
I would also like to talk about EVs. We produce electric steel, and this is applicable to EVs. And similar to Gustavo, we believe that we will not decrease consumption due to the electrification of mobility.
Talvez tenha.
We will develop better products. We will have the same amount of steel, but more technological steel, loss of magnetism, high frequency. We need explosion-proof battery compartments, etc. I agree with my colleagues that we still have some time in Brazil for some reasons.
mais antigos, a renovação não é tão rápida.
Our vehicles are a bit older. The renewal is not as quickly as in the US, for example. And in Brazil, our fleet is ecologically better than the world average because we use a lot of ethanol that is totally renewable at higher levels in other countries. Since we have a purchasing power that makes fleet renewal be slower, the steel that we need for EVs will come a bit down the road. But this is within our strategies related to research and development for the industry of EVs.
O roteiro
Let's go back to our outline
instigante,
with a very instigating point.
o mercado interno plenamente abastecido,
If the internal market is fully supplied, exports become necessary to better use the installed capacity of our companies. So the topic is how to face the international market with this huge installed capacity of 563 million tons.
vitórias, escala,
Predatory practices and protectionism on the rise. So, how can we remain competitive? Do we have systemic competitiveness? Marcelo, starting by you.
Independientemente de todas las cuestiones,
Regardless of all the regulatory issues, what always is beneficial to us is our differential in terms of industrial capacity. The Brazilian industry is competitive. If you look at the track record over the last 15 years, around 25% of our production goes to export, and it goes to the most competitive sectors. We export elaborate products containing a lot of technology. So we need to improve our industrial efficiency. We are finishing an investment of 200 million reais to improve by 20% our fuel injection into our blast furnaces, which will allow us to reduce our dependence on imported coke.
de costos mucho más competitivos para ganar.
This will allow us to be at more competitive prices to compete on an international level. So I think the path forward undergoes the efficiency or passes by efficiency. Frederico.
Concordo com o que o Marcelo colocou.
I agree with what Marcelo mentioned. Just recalling that all of us participate in groups in other countries. Benchmarking appears in all meetings. Our mills are very efficient. We are very competitive. One point that was mentioned about exports. In the second quarter of last year, when we had that drop in demand, we also exported more than half of our production to Asia because there was no market in Brazil. Of course, you can't do that in a market if you have so much production capacity if you don't have quality. But this is a huge challenge. We need to work out the Brazilian cost, infrastructure issues, because this is a endless fight. We have non-competitive trading issues. So this is a great challenge and requires the country to grow and resuming its competitive levels. And this will also allow us to generate more jobs. Gustavo,
nos Estados Unidos, como é que
you participate significantly in the U.S. market. How do you see this need for exports, and how do you see this huge challenge involving the steel mill industry upside down?
Bastante atento.
I follow this very closely during the UN meetings over the last few days. I was curious to understand what is happening and what will happen in the world over the upcoming years in a post-pandemic world. Seeing the debates in which I could participate and reading everything that was discussed, I have 4 takeaways of these UN discussions. I was really impressed by these systems that we discussed regarding climate change. This subject is so relevant for humanity. This will evolve quickly over upcoming years. This growth of militarization and defense around the world, how countries are increasing their budget and will do so in upcoming years, maybe a growth compared to recent years in reducing investments in this sector. Another very relevant topic was mentioned as a mismatch between jobs and skills. This will increase in upcoming years. The jobs that will exist and the skills that can occupy those jobs will increase. So it'll be more difficult to bring talents to companies. Now in Brazil, we have 300,000 opportunities that are open in the area of technology and digitization. And a 4th topic was a global trend to be less global and more local. These are 4 topics that were very intense in the UN meetings. And this 4th topic is strongly related to what we are discussing, that we will see this trend of the world becoming more local. This will bring about more difficulty to export, so we will have to seek very competitive solutions. Some of them have to do with the topics we are discussing here. Sometimes I feel like a marathon runner that is running with an iron ball tied to my foot. In Gerdau, in similar-sized operations, compared to our operation in Tampa, we bring our workers and get them involved in tax discussions. Here in Brazil, we have 6 buses arriving to discuss tax issues. I think in the U.S. we will exchange this car for a motorcycle. With artificial intelligence, the tax area is decreasing in the U.S. and growing in Brazil. But I believe a lot in the capacity of our organizations here in Brazil, based on our people. We have done incredible things. We have increased our competitiveness. We have overcome the difficulties of this agenda. I believe exports will grow, but we need to work out these issues of competitiveness. This has been addressed by the government, so this is my perspective on the topic as a whole. Excellent, Gustavo. This issue of exports is extremely important for us. For all our companies, exports are a business. We are present in the international market as well. Once we start analyzing the situation of our exports, we need to bring 4 points to our reflection. The first point has to do with the excess capacity at a world level. This is over 500 million tons. This is huge. And we don't see concrete actions to decrease this excess capacity. What to do with it? At the end of the 1990s, we had an action led by the OECD that promoted discussions with regard to the excess capacity, and we saw solutions that brought about some reductions at that time. At that time, we were talking about 200 million tons, not triple as we are talking about today. So a discussion at an OECD level is very important. We also need Brazilian awareness, and also on behalf of the government, that we need to act at an international market level with balanced trade practices that are realistic, both for import and export. We export taxes. Regarding steel, we have worked very strongly on the Integra issue. In our exports, we have 7% of taxes being exported. We export and bear the burden of this tax. Regarding trade relations, this is very important. The third point is that we need to work very strongly, and we are doing so, is to continually seek gains of competitiveness in our companies, seeking new technology, reducing costs, improving operations. All companies are doing this. This is a matter of survival for us. And the fourth point that is also ongoing and is long-term is with regard to the Brazilian cost. 1.5 trillion reais yearly impact Brazilian companies. This is a very high level. In the Brazilian cost, that has a series of actions, one of them, which is the tax reform, where the discussions are quite well underway, could bring about more immediate gains. Today, we have the expectation to have a vote in the Senate regarding the tax reform. This would be a very positive perspective. Gustavo compared corporate investments in Brazil and the U.S. We need to simplify taxes in Brazil, balance the tax burden, which is very heavy on the industry. So these four actions will allow us to create a competitive scenario for Brazilian exports. And this affects all our companies.
Well, all four of you dealt with competitiveness. And Sergio brings in a comment or a return to the past concerning what would be surplus capacity. And when you mention that, I remember the DAF1 plan with these 560 million tons. How do you mop it up? Economies all around the world would have to have exceptional growth in order to use all of this up, and we know this won't happen in the short term. So as Gustavo says, OECD, Sergio, well, something more practical will have to be adopted in order to solve this surplus capacity we have. Another debatable point is that considering that South America is the only region in the world that did not adopt extraordinary protection measures in the world, do you understand or are you in favor of adopting some special safeguards in Brazil? I would start with Gustavo. No way am I in favor of safeguards. I say we have the conditions to compete in the world scenario with other countries. Maybe we are the only steel
de 7% de resíduo tributário
in the world
de compra e vender matéria-prima, né?
Paying 7%
a mais
for
todo processo produtivo.
Tax residues that are generated in the production process. When we talk about Integra, and Sergio addressed it very well, it would be a short-term manner for us to place the Brazilian steel industry in a position to compete on equal terms. But it does already. It competes on an equal level.
A gente não tenha dúvida nenhuma que se houver
we increase competitiveness in each of our companies, and we can compete with steel produced anywhere in the world. I think this is what we have to go after, to reduce the Brazil cost and to increase competitiveness. Now, safeguards, in my opinion, should not even be discussed. Very well, Gustavo. Next.
Concordo, eu acho que nós não temos necessidade de nenhuma medida.
Well, I agree. I believe we do not need any special measures. Our industry is competitive. And in summary, the important word here is isonomy. The main concern in our industry is that we are in a market that is protecting itself with exceptional measures sometimes. We're not favorable to that. Brazil that we want, what we want is that the OMT rule should be adopted. We want the wrong practices to be combated.
Preocupa que ao mesmo tempo que você tem
Something that worries me sometimes, something you have practically all over the world, the whole world protecting itself, at the same time as countries are closing up and protecting themselves from surplus capacity, we cannot have measures in Brazil that are technically approved, anti-dumping measures, for instance, and due to some public interest, that these measures that are
questões de interesse público qualquer
necessary, that they are minimized due to public interest or something. So China is not a market economy, so we need to follow the OMT
no playing field, no
rules in order
isonômico de competição.
to have a playing field for competition.
Sí, no, muy alineado a lo ya comentado por Frederico y Gustavo. Isonomía.
Well, I agree with what Frederico and Gustavo said before. Isonomy needs to exist at technical level in order to guarantee fair competitiveness.
En esto falo ser técnico porque esto es demostrable, esto se verifica.
The technical side can be shown when you compete against countries that export by subsidizing power, investment, and so on. They come into the field
Ser claramente
with obvious advantages, and this needs to be fought against.
industrialização do país.
Perfeito. Eu acho que agora teríamos Sérgio, né?
Very well, I believe it's Sergio's time now. Well, this topic has been well discussed here. This is not what we have to look for. We have to look for a balance in trade relations. We're totally against any type of protectionism. We defend economic liberalism and balanced trade relations, and we would like to see international trade intensified. If world trade is intensified and it is fair, it will take cost reduction to the whole world, and this will contribute to greater well-being for people. The main restriction we have right now in the current scenario, as I said before, is a reflection on the fact that Brazil cannot be liberal in trade terms in a protectionist world. Brazil has to follow suit, accompanying what other countries do.
Seria talvez a última.
Very well, I believe this is going to be the last question before some closing words by all of you. Unfortunately, I have another 6 questions, more or less, coming in via the WhatsApp, and we will answer them to whoever asked them. But I would like to launch one last provocation to all of you, which is the following. Persistent inflation, high interest rates, more expensive credit, disorganization in public accounts, water crisis, institutional crisis, and political tension. And the sector has altered its growth forecast from 5.8 to 15, and from 15 to 24%. Do you continue to be optimistic, and why? Beginning with Sergio. Listen, Marco, in the steel industry, We have the tradition of standing up to challenge. And in Brazil especially, we have faced humongous challenges. In 2021, as was said before, well, it continues to have economic growth greater than 5%, increase in apparent consumption superior to 24%. Well, we have a deceleration in the pace of economic growth, and this should affect our business. But I am confident not just in 2022, but in the following years as well. As Minister Tarcísio said in the beginning, we already have a whole stock of decisions made and contracts signed to do with infrastructure, and these are long-term projects that will materialize in the next 3-4 years, and they will bring an important reflex to the Brazilian industry. In the case of the car industry, we have restrained demand. If you want to buy a certain car model, they don't have it to deliver to you. You have to wait till next year. So this is restrained demand that will be shifted on to 2022. 22 is an election year. In reality, the electoral process has already started in Brazil on the 1st of January 21. This is going to last for 2 years. We're going to have a period of economic reduction. The basis for comparison will be different. You will have to compare to 21, where there was much economic growth. And we shall continue to work and guarantee supply at the quantity and quality that are desired. And we will think less about exports. We are a company focusing the domestic market, where we place 80% of our production, and 20% go to exports. This year, since the domestic market had priority, we exported less than 10% of our production. Yes, I believe by and large we are optimistic. 124 kilos per inhabitant per year is something we had not dreamed about before. The country has fantastic potential. Our economy is one of the 10 largest in the world. We're talking about 200 million inhabitants, the size of a continent, and you see things in Brazil that really impress you. The industrial projects that there are here are amazing. The network of energy generation or power generation is fantastic. Yesterday, we heard someone from ANEL talking about how much the country has grown. So there is inflation, there is an energy crisis, but the country is prepared. The institutions are strong, and the country is prepared to face up to the crisis with guarded optimism. But the country has reserves and the structural capacity to put up with challenges. And this is why people are optimistic.
Agora que você fez a introdução, né?
Well, at the introduction, when you spoke about inflation and the water crisis, we can see that the challenges
Meio 2 meses atrás.
are made stronger due to things that are happening. The challenges are more difficult now than 2 months ago. I am still optimistic, and why is that? I think my colleagues said, and I will repeat them. First of all, because we can see the 100 kilos per inhabitant as a glass that is half full or half empty.
São 200 milhões de habitantes. As pessoas
It's 200 million inhabitants. The area we have, the power we have, the energy basis is better than average. So it's low consumption. That's the empty, half-empty glass. But we've been saying that for 25 years. We always say we're going to grow, it's going to grow, etc. But it will grow. This year it's going to grow 20%. And despite all the challenges, the growth has to come, and I believe it will come. The second point is the resilience of this industry.
se o mundo ia acabar.
A little over 1 year ago, we didn't know if the world would come to an end or if we would continue to operate the plants. As it was said here, the blast furnace cannot be turned off the power outlet.
A hora que você vê
So,
rapidinho já estava tudo rodando ao máximo, como eu disse.
when you see today that everything is running full speed, this is a second reason that makes me optimistic. This industry is highly resilient. All the crises, as you said, in the second half of the 21st century, there was recession in 2016, and then the pandemic, and now the drought. So
Vestem a camisa, tem orgulho.
our teams are motivated. They are proud of what they do, and I believe this is the second reason why I'm optimistic. The third reason is that we believe measures will be adopted. The country will act on the Brazil cost. We see things happening. When we hear Minister Tarcísio, we see things are really happening. So if we bring all these factors together, the glass that is half full,
Crescendo,
and Brazil is growing and has the conditions to continue to grow, you will see that there are many good things. Added to the fact that we know what the course should be and that actions will be adopted
mas ainda estou otimista.
for the country to continue growing. This is what makes me be optimistic. Gustavo, I am totally optimistic, energized, and feeling prepared to face the challenges that are coming to us. I think the whole Gerdau team feels the same. Surely the next 10 years will be better than the last 10 years. You look at the variables in the world, the cycle is going to be more positive to us than the last cycle. Brazil is moving forward. We would like it to move faster, but it is moving. And I'm also optimistic because we have the capacity to perform change. Looking at Gerdau, if we want to have a financial view on things, our performance has been fantastic. We made the company simpler, more agile.
Metodologias ágeis.
All our plants are working on value generation as if they were startups. So we're resilient, capable of advancing. We are capable of attracting and retaining people. So it's all it takes. I'm totally optimistic with our capacity to transform, our capacity as a company and as a sector. There are many variables we control, and we will look for opportunities everywhere. Well, I normally kid when I sit with my friends and colleagues in the industry coalition. We have weekly meetings. It's 14 segments that make up this coalition. Equipment, pharmaceutical, toys, electronic products. This represents about 40 or 43% of the industrial GDP of the country. And looking at that correlation between the GDP, steel consumption, and economic development, I kid with my friends. I say, where is our steel going? Where is steel going this year? I share the optimism that was mentioned here. We're approaching the end of this panel, and we're now coming to the point when each participant here in our panel would have to say some final words. I would like you, please, within 5 minutes, to give us your opinion, your view on what would be the priority or priorities for the sector. We have already mentioned this to a certain extent, but what would your view be on priorities for the future? And then we start with Marcelo.
Central topics.
Panel
We saw the sustainability panel, and it was really incredible to see the shared experiences and how we need to focus on this. The topic of carbon is certainly very, very important for the short, mid, and long term.
hemos emitido con
And in the document that we will issue, I'm very proud about this document. I think all our industrial directors have participated in elaborating this document, and we place the initiative that we foresee for the future. So it's important to integrate the entire value chain, from the supply of raw materials
el tecnicismo, lo que significa toda la cadena de valor
and consider the entire value chain that needs to contribute towards this.
movimiento de
We are developing technologies, feed technologies for blast furnaces. This is a Vale patent,
feito ya dos pruebas industriales y
and we have already conducted some tests, but we're very optimistic. This could start reducing the impact of gas. In one of our industrial operations, in our blast furnaces, mainly in Argentina, where we use natural gas at a competitive price, we have already converted 90% of our furnaces to natural gas, which is more efficient. All of us in Brazil know how to apply gas technology. This could significantly reduce the impact. So it's important to consider natural gas as a path forward. So self-reducing briquettes, fuel issues, and using biofuels in our blast furnaces. ArcelorMittal has shown how to develop a neutral industry in the long term. So this is the main challenge that we have looking forward.
él expuso que hay desenvolvimiento. No tenemos una compañía do grupo que
We have a company in the group that has patents to use direct reduction of raw material using electric furnaces. Our operations in Mexico already use direct reduction.
carbon capture.
We also have carbon capture.
Nos tenemos la tecnología, una de las compañías de nosotros.
One of the companies in our group is developing technology to reduce hydrogen in some industrial facilities in Europe. Carbon capture and carbon storage are possible solutions. We are analyzing this technology, but we still have a lot to develop. These technologies are very incipient in terms of their maturity level. We are working a lot in the private sector as well as together with the public sector to create the necessary conditions to look forward into the long term.
Va a mejorar
This will improve
la integración con las
greatly our integration with other sectors. We need to be good neighbors.
el impacto, el footprint que nos imprimimos en la industria do aço.
We need to work side by side as a steel industry, and we need to develop in a committed way these technologies
Digamos, más amigables.
so that we can be good neighbors throughout our community.
Requiere una transformación
To produce steel with less carbon emissions requires many aspects of technology and knowledge and human resources. And this is a great challenge for the future of our industry. Thank you, Marcelo. Frederico.
Eu colocaria 3 desafios.
I would mention 3 main challenges. The first one are the 3 letters, ESG. Within E, this was widely discussed. Marcelo has also touched on this. Decarbonization is very important. We also have 100% of a green coal, but we also have the blast furnaces and the scope of our suppliers. So this challenge is forthcoming. I always joke with my team. Half of my day is spent with these 3 letters, ESG. A great diversity challenge ahead as well. We still have a long path forward to have diversity in all different areas, gender, race, governance. We have our challenges, but I think the first 2 letters have received a lot more of our time than the other ones. The second challenge for the industry is related to competitiveness. Here, I would mention 2 sub-chapters. We have the indoor competitiveness. We need to be competitive regardless of being in a commodity sector. We have the entire world competing with us. So we export. We need to be competitive by means of innovation, efficiency, and benchmarks. We have operations abroad and also within our country to compare with, and we need to extract the best and make sure that we are amongst the best to survive because of this very high excess capacity. So one aspect is indoor, and also when looking outside of our walls, we talk about the Brazilian cost. So once we cross the company gate, we need to look at tax issues, strikes. Every day we have new things popping up. So I would split this competitiveness, both indoor and outdoor. And the third item would be development. And I would here talk about steel consumption. Here I would like to talk about 2 aspects. We talked a lot about outdoor. If the GDP increases and the per capita steel consumption increases, great. But I'm also looking in-house. We need to innovate, develop new products and new applications for the products we have. And in the oil and gas sector, mobility, EVs, will bring about new applications for steel. So I think we also need to innovate within each of our companies, not just to continue with the sectors we already have. We mentioned agribusiness, for example. We will increase consumption in these products, but we also need to keep an eye on other sectors that will develop. We have large volumes of steel that didn't exist a few years ago, like wind power. The pre-salt, 2-3 decades ago, we didn't have such deep exploration. So there's a lot of solutions that we can develop to leverage this economic development that will lead this consumption from 100 to 200 per capita.
Passar a mensagem final. Eu acho que despia assim do.
My final message
para dizer que eu sou muito
needs to touch on my human side. I'm very glad that I'm here, healthy, and I would like to
pandemia, né?
extend my condolences to so many families that lost dear lives to them. Many people had difficulty in facing these moments. So I extend my positive thoughts to all of you to get out of this situation as quickly possible. So as a person, I would like to thank for the opportunity of being here in such difficult times. I would also like to say that it's very touching
Da ISD.
to look at the social aspect of ESG. I would like a greater mobilization in our sector in upcoming years so that we can impact positively thousands of Brazilian lives that live in inadequate conditions
Agendas.
in times that we are advancing with other agendas. I think we can do more for this agenda. So in the future,
Esse tema e a gente queria
I would like to bring forth this topic and have stronger debates on this so that we can positively impact the lives of Brazilian society. I would like to also very dearly thank our customers. We have worked very closely with you during the pandemic. We found joint solutions. We grew in terms of our ties,
120
and this will allow us to move forward for another 120 years here at Gerdau.
E por fim eu queria fazer um agradecimento
And I would like to thank very dearly all the workers at Gerdau who together found very differentiated solutions to all the problems we faced.
protagonistas da empresa.
The Gerdau workers are the great protagonists of the company. So I must thank each and every one of you. Certainly, you did your best and gave it your most for us to be here today. Thank you, Gustavo. Sergio.
Grande desafio.
The great challenge for upcoming decades
Pessoas.
is related to people. Everything we do, everything we do deals with people. Our great challenge is to preserve the life, the health, and well-being of people.
Ano de 2020.
In 2020, as well as 2021, have faced in the history of mankind the greatest problem we have faced of all times, which is the pandemic.
No mundo inteiro, milhões.
The pandemic has taken millions of lives. Gustavo, in his comments,
A todo esse sofrimento
with regard to all this suffering
levado a pessoas no mundo inteiro.
that affected so many people around the world.
De certa forma, nos acompanhar.
The pandemic will be with us for many years. I hope that we have more effective mechanisms. One of them is the vaccine that has proven to be very effective. But treatment is very important and desirable. Another challenge are climate changes, which are a reality that is reversible. The world is worried about this because this will impact the lives of people.
Compromissos para 2000.
There are commitments for 2030 for us to get to 2050 in a world where we have neutral carbon emissions. There are already commitments. The steel industry in this decade we are living will see a lot of technology being developed, seeking
Viáveis
technologies that are feasible and disruptive that will contribute more and more to reduce CO2 emissions in the steel industry. And in the next decade, we will see when these technologies are actually implemented. If we look at the history of our business in steel,
grandes disrupções
during this decade or last decade, we saw great ruptures. We saw the LD process come about. This changed radically the production of liquid steel. In the 60s and 70s, we had the continuous processing. This changed the way of transforming liquid steel into plates. Over the next 50 years, we did not have any disruptive technology. We had important improvements, but technologies that end one process and start another, we never had. In the 30s of this century, we will see technologies being implemented that will be disruptive. So we, from the steel industry, face important challenges at a global Brazilian level. It's with great joy that we see a company here called Aço Verde, green steel, that starts with neutral carbon. I was very happy to see your presentation. And this is an incentive to all of us. As a steel industry, we'll head in this direction. In the 1950s, all of us will be neutral. In the 2050s, all of us will be neutral with regard to steel. We have important work to be done looking forward. A lot was touched on in today's meeting. All the work that Aço Brasil develops in a very intense and competent way to make our industry more competitive, contributing towards the growth of Brazil. Brazil needs to grow and grow a lot. Our deficiencies are great. Our potential is also very great. We need to act. We need to eliminate our bottlenecks and certainly start a golden era for Brazil. And why not for the next 30 years? So, Marcos, these are the great challenges we face, all based on seeking what is best for humanity. Thank you. Well, we are approaching the end of our panel. I took note during this discussion some things. I think this was very positive. I took note of some sentences that I would like to run through very quickly as our take-home messages. Supplied market implies normality. Priority is the internal market. The problem is not the lack of demand, a lack of supply, it is the lack of demand. The market needs to grow. Imports are a trade option that has been used in a normal way over the years. Nothing is exceptional in the market that justifies reducing import taxes, recovery of systemic competitiveness, and also the reduction of the Brazilian cost. And I reinforce the priority for the steel industry to approve a tax reform that is broad and reduces cumulative taxes and brings a balance among sectors. A modern sector that is capable of meeting the quality and quantity of any demand. Sustainability, climate change, and ESG. Priority agenda for our industry. Optimism with regard to the economy and the country. I would like to say that it was a great pleasure to be with Frederico, Sergio, Gustavo, and Marcelo. So with this, we close our panel. We would like to thank the members of this panel, and now we will start the closing of the Aço Brasil Congress 2021. And for this, we invite Marcos Eduardo Faraco, the president of Aço Brasil.
Mais uma vez, cumprimento a
Once again, I would like to greet all of you who participated with us this morning in the Aço Brasil Congress 2021. For the first time, our Congress has been fully online. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope the information and the discussion that took place here will have been fruitful and that we come away with a more mature view on the development of our sector. We would like to take this opportunity to invite you to join us again in 2022 for the ASSO Brazil Congress so we can continue to discuss the challenges and our agenda for the sector. Thank you very much. I wish you an excellent day.